Well, I want to first thank David and Anthony, the alumni board, and Lindsay Brelge, who really have been spearheading this. We've been asked a lot of times about how to get administrative fellowships, what value they play, and I'll be dogged. David and Anthony and the team stepped up and are preparing this for you to understand why and how and get inside tips. While we don't do what we don't secure administrative fellowships for our graduates, we are working hard right now with the alumni board to make sure that we provide as many as we can. And in the meantime, this is such a valuable opportunity to get to know this and to participate. The administrative fellowship can be one of the most meaningful parts of your program. And I'm excited to learn about this. I'm excited for you to participate in this. And I'm always here for questions, as is Lindsay, I know, and people like David and Anthony who've gone before and who clearly understand the need of this to be a family. When we graduate, we all join the family, and I appreciate you guys doing this. So I'll turn it over to them, and I'll be here for questions and comments, and I reserve the right to offer comments as we go along if you two don't mind. Actually, even if you do mind, although who's the host, did we decide? Anthony?
Technically Anthony.
Yeah, I'm hosting it, but we're both delivering the presentation, and I agree, jump in anytime. And David invited me to do the same for his presentation.
But you can mute me though, right? So just don't.
I'm not gonna mute you. We'll be loud, unfiltered.
Thanks.
Well, perfect. Well, Rula and Lindsay, thank you so much for this, the opportunity to talk a little bit about fellowship programs, for us to be able to talk a little bit about our experiences. And Anthony, can I advance the slides, or do you need to do that for me?
I have got to do that for you. So
I'll let you. Yeah, I'll let you do that. So I guess we'll go ahead and start with just some introductions to Anthony and I, and I'll start in that regard. So my name is David Spatt. I graduated from the UC Denver program in 2016. And immediately after graduation, I joined the Administrative Fellowship Program at what is now called Michigan Academic Medical Center, affiliated with the University of Michigan. And I was with Michigan for a total of 4 years, 2 years as a fellow, and then for 2 years in a post-fellowship role working with the Department of Surgery. And I quite literally, as in like less than a month ago, moved back to Denver. I'm currently working as the practice and operations manager for peds neurology at Children's Colorado. So it's great to be back, but still very passionate about these programs. I would also say that, if there are other questions that extend beyond this, one thing that Anthony, and there's also a cohort of other previous administrative fellows who are alumni, everyone's really passionate about this program. And so please feel free to use this as resources, reach out to us if we need to set up supplementary calls, other types of information. We want to make this as helpful as possible for those that are looking at it. And the final disclaimer that I'll give is that my cat loves to make himself seen on Zoom. He thinks that he's a content expert. Granted, he moved from Michigan with me, so he probably knows something. So if you see him coming in and out of frame, I apologize. But
great, and thank you for the introduction, David. And I'll go ahead and introduce myself, and then I'll advance the slides until my section. But yeah, I'm Anthony Pfaff. So I graduated from the MBA program at the University of Colorado Denver last year, so in 2020, and then joined Denver Health that same year as the administrative fellow. And so I'm still in sort of the fellowship, but also transitioning to a post-fellowship role, just because that was the timing of the opportunity that came my way. And yeah, absolutely really passionate about helping people make the transition post-graduation into a fellowship role, if that is something they're interested in. And certainly we would like to convey today exactly, why you might be interested in a fellowship or why you might not be, and help people decide. And then absolutely there's a group of, alumni that have joined different healthcare organizations in fellowship roles that we've specifically reached out to help us with, maybe more coaching and workshopping. And we'll get to sort of our whole pipeline that we're envisioning as part of this process towards the end of my presentation component. And certainly there's other fellows too that we don't have reflected in our deck that will try to grow that network. I think Anastasia registered for this webinar as well, and she's a fellow at Vanderbilt focusing in transplant. And so I bet she might be interested in helping with us as well. And yeah, we've got just a bunch of people that we've reflected and reached out to try to get some help from. But that said, I know we're getting there on time, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time because I know some people have to jump. So to that, I'll hand it back to David and leave David to kick us off on the actual presentation. So go ahead, David.
All right, if you want to go to our next. Perfect. Just a quick agenda. So we'll give just an overview of what these programs are, just kind of a crash course in administrative fellowship, sort of 101. As Anthony touched on, I think that these programs, they're really wonderful, and I thought it was a perfect opportunity for somebody like me, postgraduate, but trying to talk a little bit about how to determine if this might be the right type of program for you as you think about postgraduate opportunities. And then Anthony will talk a little bit about the applications specifically. I won't sugarcoat it. The process, the application process is fairly rigorous. It's fairly long, but we want to break that down a little bit. I think that planning is really key for that. And so we wanted to make sure that we told people sort of as soon and as early as possible so that you can begin that planning process. We won't spend time going over the alumni profiles, but in the back of the deck, which I believe will be sent out after this, there's just a little bit of a bio of some of the previous fellows. It's not comprehensive, but just an idea of sort of where people have gone and the different types of things that they've done. And then certainly we want to leave up plenty of time for Q&A for any other questions that aren't. Perfect. So starting just here with a little bit of an introduction. So just to start, administrative fellowships. So very, very broadly, but across the board, administrative fellowships are 1 to 2 year programs. They are full-time, they are paid, but they are often term limited. So when I joined, for example, the University of Michigan, I knew that I was joining for a two-year stint. I got full pay, full benefits. They even helped pay a little bit to help me relocate out there. But there is the expectation that when you join that at the end and the conclusion of that program that you will sort of graduate and that you will move on. Some programs have kind of a hard and fast finish. Michigan's was a little bit more of a sort of a soft offboarding to try to help us find some postgraduate placement. But I would say that for a fellowship specifically, one of the things that's really, really sort of phenomenal opportunity to do is to really take the skills that you've learned in a classroom and sort of that didactic classroom-based experience and to apply those in a real-world context. And so one of the things that I really felt from my experience was I'd learned all these these different concepts, even things like we were using EHRs, the different coding methodologies, or we're talking about different payment things or different structures, but then being able to see what that looks and feels like in a specific organization. So taking that, seeing it, and just sort of working and playing within that sphere. I think additionally, a huge component of all fellowship programs is really mentorship and leadership development. So almost every single fellowship program is anchored to an executive preceptor. It's a little bit different at every organization, but typically that's going to be a chief operating officer, sometimes a chief executive officer, often VPs of different organizations. Sometimes there's a physician lead that's in there. Again, at Michigan, we had the chief operating officer of the clinical enterprise as well as the medical school who were the preceptors. And part of this role is as well being able to essentially be a junior executive and go with those preceptors as well as others and sit in, hear, absorb, and just learn how large health systems make decisions, how those things trickle down, and just get some insight into that. And that honestly is probably one of the most phenomenal learning opportunities. It's often a closed door to everybody else, but as fellows, I would often joke with people that we would recruit, you kind of have the keys to the castle. You sort of just say, hey, I'm a fellow, and it's come on in and learn about this, whatever it is that we're doing, within this meeting. I think another really important part, and this is what really resonated about fellowship programs for me, was really an ability to be able to explore multiple facets of a health system. When I left graduate school, I knew that I wanted to work in a health system, specifically like a hospital-based system. But I heard, well, healthcare administration. Well, what does that mean? I wanted the ability to be able to explore what that meant in a hospital specifically. Did that mean working in ambulatory operations? Did that mean working in the hospital? Did that mean working with a medical school? Did it mean working with a shared service? And so I wanted the ability to be able to explore that. And a fellowship really provides that opportunity to work on different projects, rotations, to be able to meet with different leaders. And as part of that role, I really see it as kind of an extension of graduate school, is really taking the opportunity to learn about the different spaces and to kind of figure out where you find yourself, not only continuing to build, grow, and to develop after that fellowship, but also where you can sort of make the greatest contribution with your skills and interests. And then finally, fellowships are often seen as kind of this accelerator. You come into an organization, you have very high level of visibility, and the idea being that you can often start to apply or be really considered for roles that you might not necessarily have had the access to, or really sort of the ability to be able to apply, or seen as a competitive candidate for those roles had you not had that exposure previously. Again, just based on my own experience, I can say that in my immediate post-fellowship role, I don't think that I would have been seen as a viable candidate had I not had some of those things. Again, it's not like a fellow is going to go from the fellowship to the C-suite or anything like that, but I do think that it is a unique opportunity to sort of advance your career, again, based on the relationships and the project work that you end up doing as a fellow. I think it's important to touch on here too, just sort of where programs are. It really amazed me when I started my own fellowship journey that these programs are quite literally cross-country. So we listed a number of them here. This is by no means exhaustive, but these programs are hosted at places, academic medical centers, community hospitals, health systems. There are even some like non-health providing types of organizations that offer fellowships. The two best resources are listed here, either on ACHE, they've got a great postgraduate fellowship, and there's often a list on there. I would also, if you're interested in, for example, the University of California system, just type in name of hospital administrative fellowship and see if something comes up. Anthony, I'll touch on NAFCA, and so I won't even delve into that, but that's another a great resource. The only thing that I would point out is some of the local fellowship opportunities. UC Health as well as Children's Hospital both offer fellowships, Centura System, and then Anthony, of course, is the Denver Health. And again, even that's not exhaustive, just the local region. Yeah, so, actually, I thought this was Anthony's deck, but I guess I'll talk about NAFCA. Very recently, and one of the things that I often describe to people when it comes to administrative fellowships is that it's kind of the complement of a clinical residency. Again, that idea that you spend the classroom time, then you sort of do it hands-on. And as many people may know about clinical residencies, is there's something called the match program, where essentially you apply and then you rank places, and then the organization does that, and then it all goes some big algorithm, and then basically you're told, here's where you're going. The administrative fellowship life cycle and the application process is moving to something that is similar in concept, different in practice, but that's what NAFCA is. So the idea here is that for a long time, applications for all of these sites, they were on different timelines. They had different, they would ask for different things. They would give, it was a lot to manage, and the deadlines are being pushed farther and farther back. So a number of fellowship sites came together, and they created the National Administrative Fellowship Centralized Application System. Again, which is this idea that it sets standards for all the fellowship sites which they're asked to comply by. So essentially a common date in which applications are due, a common date in which they will do like phone screens on sites, and then when they give an offer to a fellow, as well as just some standards around how the different sort of rules of engagement, so to speak, for fellowship sites. Not all sites participate in NAFCA. Again, coming from the University of Michigan, we did not participate in this, but I would say that the vast majority of fellowship sites do. And one thing that we pointed out here, and again, Anthony will get more into the weeds on the application stuff specifically, NAFCA does charge a small fee for the applications that you submit through their portal. What they bill is the upside of that is that you only have to send your transcripts to them, and then they sort of distribute that, so you don't have to pay for multiple transcript fees. And then, as we wrote here too, and as I had mentioned, other fellowship sites may not use NAFCA. They might do their own application process. And then, and the other thing here that we included is that while NAFCA is helpful for students, it's not necessarily a good indicator of the quality necessarily of that site. So again, I think I'm biased, but I think Michigan's a good site. We didn't participate in NAFCA. So now designing a little bit of like the fellowships, your path. So first and foremost, these are highly competitive positions. So within Michigan, we would often get between 60 and 90 applications a year, and we were looking for between 2 and 3 positions. So big applicant pools, and many of these applicants are applying to multiple sites. And I know that Denver Health even received even more applications than we did at Michigan. So the important thing here is that they're competitive. And so the reason we bring that up is that that's why we want to talk to people at this point in the process, is how to make your application stand out and how to make you, if you are interested in one of these things, one of those most competitive applicants to get one of these. Here we say that so we talked about multiple applications. I don't honestly remember how many programs that I applied to, but I wouldn't say that it's out of the realm for people to apply to 10 to 15 programs. For me, I really felt like this was the sole postgraduate opportunity that I was looking for, and so I applied very, very aggressively and submitted applications to places that I was really serious about, that I had done my homework on, that I'd done informational interviews on, and that I really wanted to go to. But I think that if this is something that you're very interested in, particularly if you have an interest in looking outside of the local market, that I would say for people that are interested in these to apply aggressively, just because they are so competitive and there's so few spots. And as we wrote here as well, part of that competitiveness and part of that preparing is really not only getting your sort of resume and your application, sort of fellowship ready, but also doing all of like your homework, reading about different fellowship sites, understanding the nuances of those programs. For example, are they 1 year, are they 2 year program? And then as well, just doing some networking, so setting up informational interviews, learning about those different types of programs, and really kind of doing your homework. There is sort of the high expectation that fellows have kind of a good sense of what they're applying for. And I would say often much more so than other sort of more typical non-fellow roles might require. Yeah, and so some things to think about, if you're trying to ask, okay, I've heard all these things about a fellowship, is this the right thing for me? Again, first thing we wrote here is like, are you okay with moving cross country? And either yes or no is an okay answer for that. For me, the answer for that was yes. So I was happy, and I did apply to some sites that were here in state, but I was happy to open up my search. Some people for life reasons or just personal reasons, they don't want to leave the state, and that's also okay. All that means is it's going to limit the number of sites that you might be able to apply to. Yeah, so something important to consider. Another really important thing to consider is, are you interested in more of like the 1 year model or the 2 year model? I would say that the majority of fellowships, I'm guessing 60-ish%, Anthony, give me your thoughts on that, but tend to be more of the 1 year fellowship model, whereas the remaining tend to be a 2 year model. Again, a lot of this kind of comes down to personal preference. For me, I was more attracted to the 2 year program. My thought being is I wanted extra time to really be able to learn, explore, and really get into the different facets of an organization. And for me personally, I was worried that, if it was a 1 year fellowship, that my thought was if I got about 8 months in, that about the 8 month mark, I was going to be looking for a job. And I wanted that time to be looking for a job to be more like the 12, 14, 16. And for me, I was more attracted. I did apply to plenty 1 year programs, but a 2 year program in Michigan was a 2 year program, was my preference. The other important thing to note when you're starting to look at fellowship sites is that some are very highly structured and some are, well, quite frankly, loosey-goosey. So for example, UPMC out of Pittsburgh, they have a very structured program. You can look on their list and there's actually kind of a curriculum, essentially, kind of a graduate school curriculum, but for our fellows, you spend, X weeks here, X weeks here. For some students, that's a really, really good way to sort of get a nice smattering of an organization. The converse of that is that if you're coming in and saying, these are all of my interests and here's where I want to go explore, as well as what's going on in the organization, how do I go explore those things? Perhaps a slightly more self-directed fellowship is better for you. In my experience, Michigan was a little bit more self-directed, which for me, coming out of graduate school, was a big change, but I'm really happy that it really pushed me to think about what are my interests, how do I go to find those, how do I network with those different individuals? And I don't think either of those necessarily lends itself to a better or more robust experience. I think ultimately this really comes down to a fellow wanting to, find and explore and be their own advocate. But again, something that I think is important for people considering fellowships to consider. Another important thing, as I mentioned, is many fellowships have a preceptor who is in the executive leadership, but what type of leadership team do you want to be working with? Is the preceptor in like operations, is it the COO, or does it have to be someone that's over in like a strategy? So I think thinking a little bit about like, where is the fellowship office going to be anchored and what types of things might that give me access to? Another really good way to sort of uncover that a little bit is to have informational interviews with the current fellow cohort at each site. and just to ask them, what is the leadership structure? What's the preceptorship structure look like? Where do the fellowships sit? What does that look like? And it kind of leads into the second one here. Where does it sit? I think another important component of the where does the fellowship sit is the fellowship well known in an organization? Like if I'm walking around and people say, oh, this is the fellow, are people going to know what that means? Or is it going to be like, okay, you're this, kind of post-grad that's here. What's the institutional sort of comfort level and sort of the, how well is this program known? What have former fellows done? What types of things do they work on? How high of a level? And again, I think looking either at organizational websites or having informational interviews with fellows can be really helpful in that regard. I think it's a really important question to ask too about what do fellows do post-fellowship? I mean, ultimately, the goal of the fellowship, as we had touched on earlier, is kind of this accelerator into a post-fellow career. And so what are people doing? I mean, is there a certain track, a certain role that programs are setting their fellows into? Is the organization looking at fellows to say, we're going to train you to do X, Y, and Z? Or is it you're going to come in, you're going to experience all these things, and you're going off to do, a wide array of things? And so I think, exploring that. Again, most websites do a really good job of highlighting where their fellows are in a post-fellow capacity. But I think asking them, the one caveat that I'll give to that is that many healthcare organizations use really fancy titles and really it's really hard to understand what those things actually mean. So I would ask some of those questions, just to try to understand that. And I would also understand personally, if an organization is looking at making an investment in fellows beyond their fellowship year. For me, I wouldn't have wanted to spend 2 years at Michigan if there wasn't an interest from day one in keeping me, post fellow. That was my experience, and I think the majority of programs, if they're going to be placing that investment, view the program like that, but a good question to ask. And then finally, I think another thing to consider would be the longevity of the program. There's certainly nothing wrong with a brand new program, but I think that there can be a little bit of strength in a program that might have a slightly longer tenure. In particular, the nice thing about a slightly longer standing program is you're going to have a larger alumni base, which for me, again, at Michigan, it was a really helpful way to not only navigate the organization, but be able to think about who should I be working with, what types of projects, and then as I began to launch into a post-fellow opportunity to have those conversations. Again, the answers to these, there's no right or wrong, but just some important sort of important things. And then finally here, we just thought we'd touch a little bit on compensation. As I did mention, even though this is a term limited, it's a well compensated and it's a full-time role. Fellows get benefits, they get retirement, salary. And then typically, this is always adjusted for cost of living, but at least currently fellows are making anywhere between about $50,000 to about $70,000 a year. Again, it depends. And then the other important thing here is that unlike more traditional positions, in the fellowship world, you don't really get to negotiate salaries or really get to counter. It's pretty much a single starting salary for fellows, so that everybody that's in that class, even if it's N of one, are all on the same page. And then, as I think I had mentioned earlier, many sites do offer a relocation stipend if you end up moving out of state. Okay, Anthony, your turn.
All right. Thank you, David, and fantastic information. So yeah, I will pick it up from David and kind of talk a little bit about the fellowship application journey. This is by no means comprehensive. We just kind of want to give you an overview about what it's like. And then our thought is we'll do kind of I'll do another one of these kind of webinars that's a lot more detailed for people that really do know that they're invested and want to go the fellowship route. But we don't want to have all that unnecessary detail when people just kind of want to understand what a fellowship is. So if that's what you're here for, apologies, but certainly you can catch us next time and we'll get into that small detail. But that said, let me jump right on into it. So this is just kind of a template for one example of an approach that someone could take to getting an administrative fellowship. It goes through just year one and year two of graduate school for someone that's in kind of that typical 1 year to 2 year track. That's by no means the only option. So in yours truly's case, I did a 3-year program at the University of Colorado, Denver. I did the Master's in Finance and the MBA in Health Administration. And so mine was a little bit different. And you'll also see here too, we talk about administrative internships. Those are helpful. And certainly if you are in your first year of graduate school and you're not working full-time, or you can kind of flex things, pursuing an administrative internship would be helpful as well. But let me get into those details. So starting year one, really what you do want to do is you want to get that broad overview of administrative fellowships, which is fortunately what we're all doing right now. Certainly you can do your own research as well. David talked a little bit about salary as well as the database. So ACHE did publish a salary survey of fellowships I think it was like 6 years ago or 4 years ago at this point, that gives you kind of the midpoint. And so you can get a little bit of an idea of compensation there. I would say broadly it agreed with everything that David said. The other thing you can do though too is look back at the fellowship directory and see what the different sites are. Even if you're early on in your career or early on in your graduate school career, you can go and research sites that you think you might be interested in. A lot of the time, you can be okay moving across country, but you're going to be interested in only moving to certain specific places or interested in certain specific roles at specific fellowship sites. Starting early and just getting kind of a broad environmental scan of the options for fellowships is something that's good to do early, and certainly something that I did. And the NAFCAs as well as the ACHE directory resources were fantastic for that. But the other thing that's really, really important to do in your first year of graduate school, if you are on that kind of traditional 2-year track, is to start getting experience that's going to be applicable to the fellowship role. I think honestly the best way to be competitive is to do an administrative internship or administrative residency. But again, not everyone can do that. So an administrative internship, and this is something that David actually did, and I think that it makes you a lot more competitive for fellowships, because that's just kind of like the pipeline that most people go through to get a fellowship. It's something you do your first year of graduate school. It's typically over the summer, but sometimes it's not. There's this other thing called an administrative residency, where sometimes you're kind of like an administrative intern during the school year, and it's kind of a job. That's not something or a role that I've specifically run into much in Colorado, but I did interview many fellowship candidates this year, and several of them did opportunities like that. Fellowships are sometimes also called an administrative residency. HCA specifically calls their fellowship a residency. So the terminology there gets a little bit confusing. Don't worry too much about that. In Colorado, especially unless you're wanting to relocate for the opportunity, most of the opportunities for an internship around here are called an administrative internship. UC Health offers several. I think they do 10 a year. Great opportunity. I actually was roommates with one of the interns at UC Health over the summer. He's joining UC Health as a fellow next year. So that just gives you the idea. They take a good number of their fellows directly from their internship pipeline. So that does tend to make you more competitive. It's just something that you might want to consider.
As a quick plug for the UC Health internship as well, Tom Grona is actually the preceptor of that program. So
yeah, that very good point, David. Yep, so he's the preceptor for the fellowship program as well as the interns, and so he runs the interns and the fellows, but the interns also work with the fellows. There's a lot to learn about exactly how UC Health structures it. I won't dig into details there, but if you got questions, reach out, and then we've got some UC Health fellows in the profiles at the end. That said, for those that cannot do that, that's understood. I was working full time and I just couldn't fit the internship in. What I did is I looked for as many opportunities as I could throughout graduate school to make myself competitive. So I ran for election as the student body co-president of HAZO, and was fortunate in securing the role. And I think that made the resume look a lot more competitive. You just got to do things that are going to build that resume and make you look competitive. I think the other thing that I saw from someone who's interested in fellowships is the Health Administration Research Consortium at the university, and getting involved in that, or just anything that's going to pad that resume and make it look like you've been involved, and not just look like, but you actually were involved, is going to make your resume kind of come to the top. But that's all kind of the pre-work stuff. Then you get to the second year, and what you're going to do in the second year is you're getting ready to do a fellowship. So for those of you who might want to do a fellowship next year, you haven't done the internship, or maybe you already did and you're joining just to get some additional details, great. But then you've got to actually do the applications and become a competitive candidate. So the way you do that, in my and David's experience, we both talked about this, is the first thing you do, you don't just kind of build your resume and application, everything, and send it blind. You have informational interviews with basically every fellow, or at least one of the fellows at every single one of the sites that you're most interested in. What that is you call them up, you have really good, insightful questions to ask, because your mission on that call is to get information about the site, but you also want them to know your name and recognize you when they see your application. And so you want to do those informational interviews over the summer, and maybe sometimes you'll find something in that conversation you're like, actually, I'm not interested in that fellowship site anymore. It's good to know that ahead of time. Then you'll apply in early fall. Typically applications are due in October. So for instance, this year, if you were applying in October, typically then you would start the fellowship sometime like next July. So a year from this coming July. Some places do it a little bit earlier, like in June, some do it in September, but roughly the fall, spring, summer timeline. The selection process, we'll get into this later too, but it's typically, you apply, they kind of do a first cut of people that they're interested in talking to. They do the phone interviews or WebEx interviews, something like that. They do an on-site interview typically, and then they'll offer their most competitive candidates, and there's a whole cycle there depending on if you're NAFCAS or not NAFCAS. We won't get into that detail today. We can talk about that next time. So that's kind of the overall process. And then certainly too, if you have to relocate, you'd start moving and all that kind of stuff. And you would get the offer and decide if you wanted to accept it. Does it include relocation? If it doesn't, how are you going to manage that? All that kind of detail you'd have to figure out. But so that's generally the application journey at a high overview.
And just to put a little bit of grad school context around it, essentially it would be that first semester of your second year, your second typical year, that would be the busiest in terms of the application cycle. So everything from applying to being on site to selected would all literally happen from the start of that semester until I guess right before the new year. And so offers would be extended. So you would know where you would be going for fellowship as you were starting your second semester. So you would sort of come back to grad school, so to speak, with an offer in hand. Of course, the expectation to finish, but just to put that little context around it.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. So as far as application materials, nothing too crazy. Resume, it really behooves you to build a strategic resume. There's some details you do want to include, details you don't want to include. And just ultimately kind of a strategy to make yourself competitive just by your resume. That is probably one of the most important documents you're going to submit. But also too, something that most fellowship sites collect is a personal statement and or a cover letter or both. And so personal statement is typically left vague. There's oftentimes not even a prompt. And in that document, you're usually trying to convey you've done some research. It's almost like a cover letter in the extent that, I want to show that I'm interested in this site, that I know something about it, and that I have something to add if I were to join that organization. And one thing I'll mention, and I'll talk about this in the pitfalls too, but I'll mention it early. If you don't mention that specific fellowship site in the personal statement, you're most likely not going to get interviewed. They're like, okay, you use this personal statement at every single site. You're not interested in us. You want any fellowship. Maybe you're not the right fit for us. Depends on the person reviewing applications, but we got 275 applications this year. And I really was most interested in talking to people that were interested in Denver Health and our mission and knew something about it. As far as transcripts, typically they do need to be official. Sometimes they'll take unofficial and then need official later. Generally, it's just easier to get your electronic official transcript and send it. Sometimes they want your undergraduate and graduate. Sometimes they just want your graduate. And to be clear, every site expects that you're not done with school. They know you're in school because they typically want you to be in school. To kind of be the sort of more traditional fellowship pipeline. They expect you to apply during your second year of grad school and then join, your second year of grad school, second academic year anyway, and then start the next summer or so. And so they know you won't be done, that they'll collect your official transcript, again, showing that you graduated, because that's typically a requirement. You got to graduate to join the organization. And the letters of recommendation, typically you're going to want 3. Sometimes they collect them directly, sometimes they don't. It's honestly, that's not extremely difficult to figure out. That is one big advantage in NAFCAS. They collect the letters one time, and then there's a big advantage to that. Then you don't have to get the letters customized to every site. If they collect them outside of NAFCAS, you might generally want your recommenders to specifically in the letter mention the site you're applying to, because that shows that that was specifically on your short list of places that you're interested in. Not everyone does that. It's something I did for places that didn't use NAFCAS. And then on NAFCAS, they can only collect 1 letter per recommender. So they say, dear Fellowship Selection Committee, this candidate's awesome, you should hire him, but in much more detail. And so, there's some additional details there I won't go into. Everything's got to be error-free, formal, legible, professional writing, and absolutely site-specific, convey some interest in the site where applicable. As far as the norms, something that actually, my conversations with David, the way to think about the fellowship is kind of that almost like you're going through an executive interview process. So extreme professionalism expected, the entire time. It's not going to be, oh, you're going to get some softball questions from people kind of, reading from a script. Really, it is going to be kind of feeling you out as far as, are they a good culture fit? Are they qualified for the position? And there's a lot of different ways that they do that. They're going to put you maybe in board meetings or in C-suite management meetings, and they have to expect that you're going to behave appropriately. So the way they feel that out is through all these different norms that they expect during the interview process. So as far as the explicit norms, there's always going to be that phone screen. The conversation's got to flow. If there's awkward pauses due to something on your side, generally you don't want that. You're going to have kind of a strategy to keep the conversation flowing, have a great answer to all their questions. They got to feel like you're personable, that they can connect with you on that initial screening. But then as far as the in-person kind of interview, then you're going to meet with a ton of different people. So in a few cases, I think I met with like 20 different people. Sometimes that was like, in a few meetings, and there were maybe 4 people on a panel interview, and then there were 5 interviews or something like that. But it's almost like another instance of the same kind of behaviors they expect on the phone screen. So they'll maybe ask you questions, maybe it'll be more conversational. Sometimes it's like they do have some specific questions ahead of time. Sometimes they just want to have a conversation, and then maybe they'll pepper in a couple questions to figure out if you're qualified. Really, it's just, it's honestly kind of grueling. Typically that's like 4 to 8 hours of that. And it just goes on for a while. And I'm sure, I don't know, David, do you have anything to add on that specifically? I know there's a few different instances. No? Okay.
That's about, yeah.
Okay.
When we do the second round, we can get even more into the weeds of
Yeah, absolutely. So additional norms to mention, the intrinsic norms, they just expect hyper professionalism the whole time. You got to have that kind of executive presence. And that's some of the things that I mentioned before about, connecting with the audience that you're there with. You are going to want to wear a suit and tie for every single interview. That's just kind of the expectation. If you're an executive interviewing at an organization, typically you'd wear, formal attire. And then, you actually have to convey too that you've done some research about the organization, and you want to know, kind of what you might want to do there, what you might want to contribute, what service lines are you interested in? If there's a big investment or big project or something that's going on with the organization and you don't know about it, haven't done any research about it, and it's like the big thing driving the strategic plan for the next 2 to 10 years, the conversation might kind of stall. So those are things that you're going to want to do ahead of time. Mistakes and pitfalls. So lack of attention to detail. It's either like not doing the right components of the applications or making errors, grammatical or otherwise. One of the issues that someone did in NAFCA this year is they submitted their resume for their personal statement. So they submitted their resume twice on accident, and I caught them and emailed them about it. Just kind of making those errors doesn't, a good candidate make, at least on paper, especially when there's, 100 other applicants that didn't do anything like that. And that's just the sad state of affairs. Like, you could be the best candidate, but then you make some errors, some silly mistakes. And they're like, well, what else am I going to get with this candidate? And, are they really worth the phone screen? Just don't make any errors, and you want to have any issues with that. And the way you can do that too, something that I did was I just literally read all of the documents I submitted word by word. You read it over and over again and revise it. And because of that, you kind of read it really quickly. You read it word by word, you'll catch those kind of mistakes. The other thing too, and we've mentioned this a bunch of times, you got to do research on the site before applying. So you got to know what's going on. How's their balance sheet looking? How are the financial statements? Like, I dug into the financial statements of almost every site I interviewed at. I wanted to know information about the strategic plan ahead of time if they had one. Being able to talk about that during those informational interviews and the interviews themselves and the phone screen, it tends to make you a little bit more competitive as a candidate. You just got to make sure all your application materials are received. So letters of recommendation, especially for sites that collect them directly, it's not really the letter of recommendation person, writer's job to make sure it makes its way there. You have to follow up and make sure that your recommenders have sent them if they have to send them directly. And if you're the one that collects them and distributes them, you just kind of got to make sure that gets done. Same thing with the resumes, all the other stuff. The other thing too is, it's a mistake to wait until the deadline to apply. Let's say you start the week before applications are due. There's just so much repetition and so much detail and all this research you got to do. If you start that week, you're unlikely to be successful. And There's so many candidates that apply. Fortunately for you, for everyone that's interested in fellowship, a good chunk of people kind of look like they start that late week or maybe even the last month. And so if you do some of these key behaviors and things ahead of time, you'll ultimately rise to the top and be a very competitive candidate. So I know we're throwing a lot at you and saying, oh, it's so competitive and formal and all that. If you just do some of these things, you've got a pretty good fighting chance of getting a fellowship. The other thing too, oh, go ahead, David.
I was just saying the funny thing too is that these, of course, all come from like personal experience with candidates that have done these things. So some of them, of course, sound really silly and like, of course, I wouldn't do that, but they're all like around like, you know, what silly things did you see when you were reviewing applications? These are literally like a homegrown list from that. So they do sound very obvious, but they happen literally every single year with applicants.
Yep, and if you apply late, don't apply late. Like I got a couple late applications, just like, you know, we set the deadline online, and I can't accept the late application. It's just not how it's going to happen. Because again, you've got, you know, 3 to 6 months to start on this. So being late, it just doesn't. It's not a good look. The other thing I'll say too is you might get an offer for an interview or even the offer to accept the position. Typically, you're going to want to be really responsive and quick on that. This is something that David emphasized in my conversations with him as well, from the Michigan perspective. Yeah, so within 24 hours to respond to emails or calls, scheduling an interview or accepting an offer, so on and so forth. And then finally, honestly, the biggest mistake, is something that's really going to, as long as it goes well, it's really going to make you rise to the top, in my opinion, is that informational interview. So you reach out, you have a nice email chain with a fellow to say, hey, can we set up a conversation? I'd love to learn more about the organization. I'm very interested in it, so on and so forth. And there's a strategy to approach that. We won't get into those details. You're going to want to do that for every site you're interested in. Those are typically like a 30-minute conversation. So if you're applying to 5 or 14 sites, it's a time commitment, but it ultimately is worth it because it will make the whole application have a much higher likelihood of success at various sites. Okay, so there's that. Once you receive an offer, typically 24 to 48 hour window to accept the offer. NAFCA changes the calculus of this a little bit. I won't go into those details. Again, they have a unified offer acceptance deadline, so it depends on how close to that deadline you get the offer. You do have to finish your degree, and they will verify it with that final official transcript, so make sure you do that. It also behooves you, the transcript is collected as part of the application. It does behoove you to do well in graduate school. A lot of the most competitive applications that I reviewed had that, high GPA. Certainly it's not the, end all be all, but typically, especially in grad school, A's and B's are passing. So if your GPA is above like a 3.5, that's typically pretty good. And certainly I saw a lot of applications that were higher. Anyway, and then there's also other organizational specific requirements. So there are many sites that do drug screens. There's also many that don't. Pretty much all of them are going to do a background check, maybe even a credit check, financial check, all that kind of stuff. It really depends on the organization and their policies, but expect to get a lot of that once you accept the offer. Let's see. As far as next steps, so we really do see this as a pipeline. We want to help folks be successful. Certainly myself and David and many other fellows that have reached out and offered their services really do want to help the CU Denver network, current students and alumni be successful if they're interested in a fellowship. So this is the first informational webinar. We just want to give people an overview of what's going on, what the application process is like. And then we would like to host a more detailed second informational webinar for those that are interested in really getting into the details. We won't be able to cover everything in that, but we won't cover the kind of high level overview. We'll cover the specifics there. We'll do that for an hour and then we'll start workshopping. So we've had people volunteer that said, yep, I'm interested in helping, fellows optimize their interview skills, the informational interview skills, help them, review the resume, things like that. And so we've got a crew of people that are interested in doing that. And so our pipeline is attend this webinar, attend the next webinar. If you attend both, our crew will help you optimize your application and your interview skills in a way that's going to maximize your chances for success. Something I won't go into in detail, but I'll just touch on it, and then we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end, is we did want to give people, an idea of where people end up post-fellowship from our program. There are a lot of people that have graduated from our program that have successfully attained fellowships, extremely competitive ones too, like, for instance, David's, as well as Betsy Stanley, who helped put this deck together. So credit to you, Betsy, if you're on the call, at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, a very competitive and well-known administrative fellowship. So people do place high, and I think if you follow these strategies, you'll ultimately be successful. But so just to give you kind of a quick overview of some of the places that people have ended up, this is by no means comprehensive, not even from the last 5 years, just the people that we've kind of reached out and talked to. So you can see the organizations here. You get Denver Health represented, relatively newer fellowship. I'm the incumbent. UC Health, Kaiser Permanente, David with respect to Michigan Medicine, like I said, Brigham and Women's, and then UPMC, Presbyterian, Shady Side. We've got the profiles of where people are going and all those kind of positions and what their background is. I'm just going to scroll through these, and then we'll send the deck out after to people that are registered, so you can review it at your leisure. That said, that is the conclusion of our formal remarks, and it looks like we do have about 13 minutes, and I've got time to go over. So if people are available, I know classes will start at some point here.
Yeah, I was gonna say
class today, but yeah, so we've got 12 minutes for anyone's Q&A at this point, and yeah, so if anyone does want to unmute and ask a question, go ahead and fire away.
And I'll just quickly interject, and Anthony, thanks much for all that background. I would just say we've thrown a lot of information at you, right now. I know that, all into the details of applications and stuff. I think that the big takeaway from this presentation, if I were sitting in your seats as a current student, is to just think, okay, is this something that I'm interested in? And am I interested in just learning more about that? And then perhaps returning to this deck. If you didn't memorize all of the application deadlines and all those expectations, that's totally okay. I think step one is, am I interested in this? Might I be interested in moving out of state? That's, I think, where I would start with some of this, and then we can move forward with that. But again, we're here as resources, and we'll help coach you through it. And if we need to have the same conversation and all of this back over again, we can do that as well. So yeah, questions?
Thank you both so much for presenting. That was, it was wonderful. I've been considering looking into this, and I didn't even know where to start. But I'm wondering where you would get information about the strategic plan of an organization if you're not already affiliated with it.
Yeah, I can answer that. Great question. And then I'll turn it over to Bill because it looks like he raised his hand. But to answer your question, oftentimes it is on the various websites of systems. So one of the places that I applied and was successful in getting interviews for was University of California, San Francisco. They had their whole strategic plan online. They were very transparent about it. Now, was it going into things like market shares and dollars and cents? Not necessarily, but at least had a broad overview of everything that they were trying to accomplish. And certainly it was driven by their mission, vision, values. And that's not something that made its way into the deck. You'll often get interview questions about an organization's mission, vision, values. I know our leadership class at the university emphasized, organization's mission, vision, values as kind of a prerequisite to, the strategy class, a prerequisite to building a strategy. And so you can go review that too. So just Google around, see if you can find their financial statements, see if you can find the strategic plan online. If not, that's okay. Because yeah, sometimes it's sensitive, competitive information. They don't want to share it, or they don't want to share it all in detail. You can definitely be pretty successful reviewing mission, vision, values. And then on the financial statements too, a lot of these places are nonprofits, so you can find information on that. Not that you necessarily need to dig into all the details, but some of the overview goes into things about the strategy. There's a couple websites that let you find financial statements for nonprofits. So 409 Finder is one of them. That's, I think, the tax return form for nonprofits. Sometimes those are on people's websites, and for-profits, obviously, you can find it in Edgar on the SEC. I don't know, David, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, largely speaking, if it's on their website, that would that's really all as a candidate you'd kind of be expected to know. And nobody's going to ask you in an interview like, what's our strategic plan? But the high level stuff, I mean, if you can find it fairly easily by looking on the website, particularly if the fellowship has its own portal and its own thing, those are the kind of things that would really, you really should review. But nobody's going to ask you, what are the pillars of our strategic plan or anything like that.
Yeah, it's true. Sorry, Bill, did you have something to add? I saw that you raised your hand earlier.
There are three of us in this meeting, Rulon, Zach, and I, that are old timers. And when we had administrative residency, what I would do is look for local stars. And it turned out that Dave Jepson was the CEO of what was University Hospital back then, now Anschutz Medical Center. He went on to become the head of Intermountain Healthcare. Another approach is to Google thought leaders in healthcare and identify people. I was able to introduce myself to Obama's CTO for health, Anish Chopra, and Donna Lynn, the former lieutenant governor. And that particular panel was part of a meetup group. So you might all of you currently might want to look at Meetup, go to meetup.com and look for healthcare in Denver and start attending some of these meetings to meet some of the local leaders at those meetings. Just tips.
Fantastic tips. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I did some of that too. It's great when you can network with people that might be interviewing you ahead of time. So fantastic to add. Any other questions?
Other questions?
Hey, I had a question. What about if you're graduating not in May, if you're graduating, say, in December, how does that work?
So fellowship cycles are pretty set. There are a few places that I know will offer sort of what I'll call like an off-cycle start. But I would say that for the majority of those, and we saw a few of those at Michigan, they would just apply in the next cycle. Yeah, would probably be my answer for that. But what you could do potentially as an applicant, if this was still something you were really interested in, you could graduate and then you could find a temporary type of position, so that you would have some of those other experiences on your resume, and then use that to bolster your application as you begin to apply and prepare.
I just wanted to jump in too, David, and say we have had some graduates who graduated in December take fellowships. They just had to wait that 6 months for that. Like we're
Gotcha.
for the current cycle, they just waited the 6 months. So
I suppose that's another option as well, is if you applied in that standard cycle, you just wouldn't go back to grad school.
Yeah, and to be clear too, not all fellowship sites, in fact, I would say roughly maybe 50-50, require that you currently be in graduate school or recent grad. It is more traditional to be a recent grad, and so if you're years out of graduate school, you're generally going to be looked at as a little bit less competitive for a fellowship. But if you're a year out, and especially for sites that don't have that stipulation that you be a recent grad or currently in school, you could apply far off cycle. And I know some sites that specifically say that's part of their equity initiative. They don't want to, have ageism or anything like that as part of their selection process, since graduate applicants usually tend to be a little bit younger, and so they say you can apply anytime. So that's something to look at in their application requirements as well, because that will be spelled out as to when you'd be eligible. And then I see Zach, you raised your hand, but you're also not unmuted. So did you have a question that you wanted to ask? And maybe you already asked it in the chat. I didn't look.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Zach.
Hi, thanks, Anthony. Thanks, David. Great presentation. It was so just awesome to see these tips and tricks and just a really good preparation plan laid out for everybody. So thanks, Bill, for the introduction too. I'm Zach Robinson. I was a fellow at UC Health in 2010 to 2011. They had just started their program, so I believe I may have been the second fellow as that role was getting started. And then met David Spatt and Matt Doffenbach through their internship programs and also their fellow interview cycles. So nice to be back in touch and then see Matt's information up there. Did want to mention too that, as Anthony was saying, to be able to figure out what you're going to do is really important. And as I was wrapping up my graduate program in 2008, I was offered a job and I was trying to determine if I wanted to start the workforce or go ahead and do a fellowship. And I was offered a role in graduate medical education, academic programming with, well, back then it was the University of Colorado Health Science Center. And we were training physicians on health information technology. And one of the graduate programs within the School of Medicine needed a program coordinator and some operational support. So I took that role and enjoyed it and just got to know kind of the academic medical environment for about 2 years, and then had the opportunity to start my fellowship cycle. So I didn't really catch any pushback or rejections or refusals by not being a current or recent graduate with 2-year work experience. I felt that getting into the workforce for just a few years prior to entering the fellowship was an advantage where I could just speak to a lot of work projects and environments and just be able to come to interviews with a lot more experience on my plate rather than only graduate school. So it was good. It was a great experience. And then just want to let this group know I'm available too if you want to link up with me or reach out. I don't know if y'all have a formal program with any fellowship preparers or mentors, or just happy to have a conversation with anybody who'd be interested in this journey, and happy to be helpful if I could. So thanks again. Great presentation, guys, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Yeah, thanks, Zach.
Fantastic, Zach. Yeah, thank you for adding that.
Any other questions?
Any other questions from folks? I know we're getting close to class start time.
This is really, really good, guys. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the support.
Yeah. And Lindsay, we're recording this, right? Can we keep this on file for students? Is that what we're planning?
Yeah, it's being recorded.
Yeah.
Awesome. That'll be, because
again.
it'll be really nice just to be able to refer people here if they have questions and create a little, and I guarantee you, Cam, you will see this.
That's a really good idea, Rulin. Yeah, we'll find a place to post it, maybe on the website or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just echo again that for any students that have any other questions, I know that this is a daunting process. I remember when I was starting it that it feels like, perhaps even unobtainable, but it is totally obtainable. It's just a matter of just going through the steps. And so again, just as Zach said, please rely on, us as alumni. We're trying to build a little bit more of a structure, a little bit more of a network around this. And again, right now we're sort of building this plane as we're flying it, but please use us as resources. And as I'll echo what Zach said, I'm happy to be that resource. I'm happy to have, a secondary call, or, happy to, respond to some emails or something like that. But yeah, we are here to sort of help guide you through this process. And as overwhelming as it can be, I think that the juice is very worth the squeeze. And I think that almost every single fellow, at least I can speak for myself here, I would absolutely go back through not only the entire process, but the entire fellowship program again. I mean, it was absolutely exactly what I was looking for.
All right.
Thanks,
I guess
guys.
I'm the presenter, so I think we'll end it there.
Great event.
Feel free to reach out, and we'll send the slides out via email to all the registrants. So don't feel like you had to screenshot the slides. And we'll be in touch just to reach out to folks that might be interested in that next version of our webinar. But thanks all, and have a great class if you're going to class, and have a great evening otherwise. Bye all.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great work.